Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson, and I have people all over the country write to me and ask to purchase signed copies of my books, and in fact, people all over the world. And I'm extremely aware of the atrocious state of the US Postal Service. Please note, I do not blame the postal employees for this situation whatsoever. The Postal Service here is in this condition because of a deliberate economic policy battle that has been raging for well over 100 years and which is increasingly being won by the wrong side. And this philosophical battle is very important to everyone to understand because it's at the heart of what is destroying standards of living around the world. So please watch this attempt to explain what is going on, because you won't see this in any conventional news coverage, and you won't even be taught this in school, even in most universities, even if you choose to major in economics or political science, and that's by design. The story begins with the concept of what classical economists call economic rent, which can be defined briefly as unearned income, which can also be expressed as the excess of market price over intrinsic cost. This concept was a central focus of the economists of the 18th and 19th centuries, as Professor Michael Hudson describes in his books and published articles, including this one from 2011 entitled Simon Patten on Public Infrastructure and Economic Rent Capture. Economic rent, or unearned income, is such an important concept to understand that I've placed it in the very center of the chalkboard here. Everything else is going to center on this concept. Economic rent is income that you don't have to work for. You don't have to earn. It just rolls into your bank account, even in your sleep, as John Stuart Mill famously described it. How do you get economic rent? You basically get it as a privilege. There's three main ways or categories, ways to get economic rent. One is to privatize the gifts of nature that are given to a nation for your own private increase of wealth instead of for the good of everyone in the nation. Another is to be granted a monopoly over some good or service. And then a third way is to be granted the right to charge private fees on infrastructure, critical infrastructure. Professor Hudson explains that basically these are all forms of being granted the right to levy a private tax against other citizens. In other words, a tax that goes to enrich private companies and private individuals instead of a tax that goes to the government, to the public sector. It goes to the private sector. So let's divide this chalkboard now between the two opposing economic views. The classical economists on the left over here, who basically arose in the 1700s and 1800s in opposition to the kind of economic rent that characterized the feudal and medieval periods in Europe, and of which many aspects still remained into the modern period. And then on the other side, we'll put the so-called neoclassical economists, who were basically a backlash against the classical economists, starting in the late 1800s. In the article by Professor Hudson that I mentioned, Simon Patten, who is mentioned in the title, was articulating the classical position, and the neoclassical opposition was raised by his ideological opponent, John Bates Clark. The neoclassical position later transformed or became even more ferocious and turned into what we know today as neoliberalism, beginning with some of the Chicago school economists such as Milton Friedman, and implemented by neoliberal politicians such as Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. So let's contrast these two positions, and we'll do it with respect to the question of economic rent, also known as unearned income. The classical economists of the 1700s and 1800s largely wanted to reduce and in fact eliminate economic rent. They realized that the economic rent represented a drain on the economy, any economy, enriching a subset of the population at the expense of everyone else. The only real way to reduce and eliminate economic rent is through the enactment of laws, which means that it must be done at the level of government. Now, the neoclassical economists, such as John Bates Clark and his descendants, including the entire neoliberal order, which has now taken over both parties in the US and most other Western countries, does not want to reduce economic rent at all. They actually want to reduce and eliminate the barriers to rent seeking and to fight any attempts to introduce laws which seek to restrict rent seeking. Professor Hudson explains that when the classical economists, including Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, talked about free markets, they meant markets that were free from economic rents, that is, free from unearned income, free from private taxation, free from rent-seeking behavior. But in contrast, when the neoliberal, post-classical economists talk about free markets, they mean almost the completely opposite thing. They mean markets that are free from any interference in rent-seeking behavior, particularly free from government interference in rent-seeking behavior. The understanding that economic rents are a form of unearned income is kind of like a litmus test. John Bates Clark and the neoliberals argue that there's actually no such thing as unearned income. They try to make everyone believe that rents, such as monopoly privileges or the privatization of natural resources, are just the same kind of thing, same category as profits earned by producing real goods or wages that are earned by actual labor. An example of an economic rent might be if the state of California granted me the right to charge tolls on a freeway or a bridge and keep them for my own bank account. That'd be like a ticket from the government to just start levying my own private taxes on my fellow citizens. The classical economists would call that unearned income. I don't do anything to get that income. I just have this special privilege to charge tolls and put the money in my own bank account. It's not the same as profits earned from, say, building a brewery and making beer and selling that beer, or growing wheat and making bread and selling that bread, or building cars or airplanes or ships and selling those, or working in a shipyard to make the ships and earning wages. It's a totally different category. It's unearned income. But the neoliberal school says there's actually no difference. That's why you don't even hear very much about economic rent anymore, or you don't even hear the words unearned income anymore. They're trying to get rid of that whole concept. If they get rid of the language, you can't even think about it, like George Orwell talked about in the book 1984. But on the other hand, the classical economists understood that unearned income actually takes place at the expense of real wages paid to workers and at the expense of real profits earned by industry. It doesn't come by producing anything. It comes by somehow being granted the privilege to privatize the gifts of nature, or being granted a monopoly over something which is enforced by the government, or by privatizing infrastructure, such as in the example where I was given the right to charge my own private toll on a bridge or a road. The classical economists saw infrastructure as a critical aspect of the economy, a critical positive factor of production. They believed that critical infrastructure should be public and that government should provide infrastructure for the health and benefit of the public. And that's something that was expressed by Simon Patton. He explicitly wrote about this in the 1890s. Some examples that Patton gave of infrastructure include parks, schools, gasworks, waterworks, courts, post offices and the Postal Service, streets, and river and harbor improvements. Today we might also add the electrical grid, access to high-speed internet connectivity, and the electromagnetic spectrum itself over which much of our data traffic travels, especially for wireless devices. And note that schools, which Simon Patten did talk about, should also include public colleges and universities. In fact, by the 1870s, we had public colleges, such as the University of California, which has in its charter that it shall be free to all qualified citizens of the state of California for as long as possible. When it was chartered back in the 1800s, that was actually part of the charter of the University of California. First campus was at Berkeley. Neoliberalism, however, has a philosophical opposition to government spending on infrastructure and considers it a deadweight cost with no benefit to society. The general neoliberal plan, which has been enacted over the past several decades, accelerating since the late 1970s and early 1980s, is to starve public infrastructure in order to get that public infrastructure into private hands, because as we've already seen, infrastructure is a tremendous source of economic rent. It's a great way to get a hold of unearned income. So that's why economic rent is at the very center of this chalkboard. It's like the gear that drives this whole discussion. So in order to starve governments of the ability to provide infrastructure, neoliberals want to impose what's known as fiscal austerity, which means the reduction of government spending and the increase of government taxation. Usually, they split this plan into two opposing parties, such that one party is always talking about reducing government spending, while the other party is always talking about increasing taxes. So the two sides work together like the two blades on a pair of scissors to enact austerity. One side's always trying to cut spending, the other side's always trying to increase taxes. And together you get fiscal austerity, higher taxes and lower services, lower government spending, less infrastructure. The lie that's always trotted out to try and falsely justify this damaging fiscal austerity is some version of the quote, "we can't afford it" excuse, which is what you're hearing right now in the discussions around the US Postal Service. That is completely false, as the economists who developed modern monetary theory, MMT, have explained. Sovereign governments, such as the government of the US or the government of the UK, can create their own money at any time and spend it into the economy as necessary. The only real question is whether they have enough actual resources in the economy. For example, if you have a total of 300 million citizens, you can't actually have 300 million people working full-time for the Postal Service, plus 300 million people working full-time in the Army, plus another 300 million people working on the roads and bridges full-time, and another 300 million people making beer and baking bread. You're going to run out of resources. In this case, you'll run out of people, which are the most important resource in any economy. But you could very easily create more money to have a postal service that is the envy of the world if you wanted to. You could hire more people, especially if you've got unemployment. That just shows, as Warren Mosler, one of the pioneering voices of MMT, has explained, if you have rampant unemployment, which we do have in the United States, you have a situation where you're not spending enough. You're either taxing too much or spending too little, or both. If you have idle resources such as unemployed or underemployed men and women. So the whole idea that we don't have enough to afford a postal service or a proper postal service is a complete lie. We could very easily create the money to have a postal service that's first class if we wanted to. We would not run out of money at all. The idea that the post office needs to raise its prices to be able to be profitable is completely false. The classical economists believe that critical infrastructure should be provided as inexpensively as possible, or even for free, just like we have interstate freeways in the US that are generally free. Almost everywhere the interstates are free. because this critical infrastructure at lower costs, the classical economists understood, makes a stronger economy possible. The reason some people oppose it is because they want to privatize infrastructure, or else they want to create companies that can charge higher amounts for the same service, and they don't want to have to compete with the public version. Like, they don't want to have to compete with the Postal Service. The Postal Service, if we wanted to, we could make it so that I could send books to France or to Australia, where people have asked me for my books, for 3 cents or for 5 cents. The government doesn't have to run a profit. They can create as much money as they want to. And by providing a postal service infrastructure as inexpensively as possible, just like roads and high-speed rail, you actually create a stronger economy that's able to produce less expensively and more competitively. But when you drive up the cost of everything, you create a less competitive, less productive economy. Now, just because MMT describes how money is created does not mean that any uses of created money are all equally positive. It doesn't mean just create money for everything. That money actually moves resources around. There's only so many resources in any nation. But the classical economists saw the use of government spending on public infrastructure as being a benefit to society and a benefit to production. So that's what you use it for. Now, there's people on the other side, the neoliberalism side, who also actually know very well that the government can create as much money as they need to create. They're just pretending to believe that we would run out of money. They know very well that the government can create the money, but they would like to create it not for public infrastructure. They want to create it for rent seeking, to benefit rent seekers, rather than to spend it on public infrastructure. And that's exactly what's going on. Economic rent is at the heart of this entire discussion. As Michael Hudson explains in that article from 2011, the early opponent of the classical economists, John Bates Clark, the forerunner of today's neoliberals, argued that economic rents, which involved no real cost of production, were actually just the same as wages earned from working or profits earned from producing out into the economy, as if money that I might get by collecting tolls is actually the same as wages earned by somebody who's making a ship or brewing beer. Professor Hudson writes, quote, however, Patton pointed out that such charges, that is economic rents, are by no means intrinsic and inevitable. Wealth in the form of income-yielding assets, that is economic rents, is provided freely by nature. Yet natural and artificial monopolies are legal property rights that do not require labor to create or maintain. Rentier rights, that is rent-seeking rights, rents, are legalized toll booths to extract revenue that rightly should belong to the public sector. End quote. The ancient world saw these gifts of nature that Professor Hudson is describing as being freely given by the divine realm, by the gods. I would argue that the deliberate overthrow of the ancient wisdom led directly to the establishment of the system of economic rent that dominated the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages in Europe and continued right up through the period of the classical economists, who were trying to roll back those institutions of economic rent, beginning in the 1700s and the 1800s with the classical economics. Beginning in the late 1800s, the neoclassical school launched a counterattack against the classical economists, the ones who were threatening the systems of economic rent. And these neoclassical or anti-classical or post-classical economists are the forerunners of today's neoliberalism, which is currently wreaking intentional destruction on public infrastructure, from schools to post offices to roads to electrical grids and other forms of infrastructure. The understanding of the concept of economic rent or unearned income is at the center of this economic battle, which is impacting all of our lives right now. An economic rent is a form of stealing the gifts of the gods, or if you prefer, the gifts given by nature, given to all the people, and instead diverting their benefit to a privileged few. The people, in a democracy, actually have the power to fix this situation through the legislature, which can enact laws to eliminate rents, those rents will, if left unchecked, end up destroying an economy and destroying a society by making it so expensive to produce anything that the economy will no longer be viable. But the people can't fix the problem if they don't even understand it. It's not actually that difficult to understand, but you've probably never had it explained to you. I never had it explained to me. I had to learn this by researching economists like the indispensable Professor Michael Hudson, or the MMT economists like Warren Mosler and Stephanie Kelton. I would recommend watching videos of Michael Hudson and reading his articles and books, which you can learn about on his website at michael-hudson.com. And I'd also recommend watching videos of Warren Mosler, one of the founding voices of MMT, and reading his books and articles, which you can find in the, quote, mandatory reading section of his website at moslereconomics.com. And my mention of these authors and economists is not intended to imply that they endorse my views or my writings in any way, but I do see this subject as being very much connected to the subjects that I write about. And it is a subject that obviously impacts all of us. So I hope that you will share this video and take the time to research more on your own. Thank you for watching.